All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to another video. In today's video, I have a debate for you. This is just a clip from the debate because we ended up going for something like 4 hours, a very, very long time. We covered topics ranging from, Mesoamerica to Jewish overrepresentation to race realism. And so I'll be uploading parts of the debate over the next few days. This first one is us going over the necessity of IQ for building complex advanced societies. And we touch on some of the themes that recur throughout the debate. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. If you do, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and let me know what you want to see next in the comments. If anyone else wants to debate, I'm always open and down to debate anyone. So, yep.
Yeah, no, that sounds good.
All right, sounds good. I have a little bit here just because there were multiple points, but I'll try to make it pretty quick. So your first point, you say that, let's see, Nick points out later in the discussion that Asians have the highest IQ on average. I agree with that. I know that he admits that they are higher IQ. You say the point you're making is missing the mark. I obviously disagree with that. You say race realism does not preclude the influence of culture or other circumstances, rather. I agree that race realists do allow for environmental factors, though. I think we can both agree that they emphasize the importance of genetics. Like, they're not going to say it's 1% genetic for the most part, right?
I mean, I would say that the discussion often focuses on that because that is left out of most discussions.
Right, it's the controversial part.
Yeah.
Certainly.
So,
though, if it were 1%, I don't think it would have any policy implications. That's my point. That's why I think that race realism, if it is going to be something that should be discussed because it has bearing on policy, it's going to have to be more than 1%.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, obviously it's hard to nail down a specific percent.
Sure.
But I think it's a significant factor.
Sure. And that's what I would take to be the race realist position. Often they use heredity as a proxy. So they'll say, 60% or something like that because that's about the heritability of IQ within group populations. Yeah. But okay, so we agree there. And then you say, however, populations with an average IQ of 60 to 80 have never and clearly never will produce advanced societies. So going through here, I would say that my response didn't miss the mark because what Nick said is that Europe succeeded, quote, because they were smarter. There were no other factors that he listed. And as such, the implicit point being made is that it is sufficient. And my point was to point out that it's not sufficient because there are societies that are higher IQ that never went into that upward spiral, as Paul Kennedy called it. And that was as a consequence of purely environmental factors like the turn inward in the 15th century for China, for example. And so it's not sufficient, but it appears that in your comment, you sort of walk it back to maybe being a necessary condition, which is why you say that populations with an average IQ of 60 to 80 have never and will never produce advanced societies. I also disagree that it's a necessary condition. Now, it's a little bit difficult to argue this point, but because, there's been so much cross-cultural exchange that if I point out, maybe an invention in, Africa, a lot of the times, like Nick did it in a clip the other day I saw, they'll say that was brought in by other societies. And so what I want to do is focus on the Mesoamerican societies because there was no external influence for the Mesoamerican societies. And on top of that, they are peoples who would fall into that range, especially prior to the introduction of Spaniards. They would have had an IQ in the range or even below the range of 60 to 80. My evidence for this is that Guatemala, a mostly native nation, has an average IQ. Some estimates put them in the 40s. I think that's ridiculous, but nonetheless, they're almost always placed amongst the lowest IQ countries in the world. So that gives us a good proxy for what the natives would have been like, a couple centuries ago. Do we agree with that? Okay. So let's take a look at some of the Mesoamerican societies then. The Mayans, they inhabited places like Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Now, they had quite a bit of advanced technology and science. They could predict solar eclipse. They had calendars that are as precise as the ones that we use today. They used astronomical observations as a means to aid them in farming. Their astronomy was combined with their engineering in such a manner as to accord with their philosophical and cosmological beliefs. I'm quoting from an article here. It says, the pyramid at Chichen Itza, I don't know how to say that, in Mexico is situated according to the sun's location during the spring and fall equinoxes. At sunset on these 2 days, the pyramid casts a shadow on itself that aligns with the carving of the head of the Mayan serpent god. The shadow forms a serpent's body. As the sun sets, the serpent appears to slither down into the earth. So that's a pretty complex engineering feat coupled with a necessary understanding of astronomy and mathematics. They had looms for weaving cloth. They discovered the process of vulcanization of rubber 3,000 years before it was patented in 1843. And this isn't just my opinion. Like, if I were to quote from an article, this is from the Fleet Science Center. It said the ancient Maya achieved an unparalleled understanding of astronomy. Now, even if you don't buy that they were unparalleled, they were certainly amongst the best in the world at their time. They developed an advanced system of mathematics that allowed them to create a set of calendars unrivaled in the ancient world. Their logo-syllabic writing system has fascinated linguists for centuries and has only recently been decoded. They figured out how to grow corn, beans, squash, cassava in sometimes inhospitable places, how to build elaborate cities without modern machinery, how to communicate using one of the world's first written languages, and how to measure time using not only one but two complicated calendar systems. So that's the Maya. Just wanted to throw that out there. And one more, the Aztecs. For the Aztecs, I wanted to actually use Cortez because, he is a Spaniard, and he definitely believed in the superiority of the Spanish relative to the indigenous, yet even he had to admit the level of complexity of the societies in which he was interacting. He says, and this is a stripped down quote, but I kept the bare bones, he said, "In order, most potent sire, to convey to your majesty a just conception of the great extent of this noble city of Tenochtitlan, it would require the labor of many accomplished writers and much time for the completion of the task. I shall not be able to relate 1/100th of the part of what could be told, but I will endeavor to describe what I myself have seen, and imperfectly as I may succeed in the attempt, the account will appear so wonderful as to be deemed scarcely worthy of credit, since even when we who have seen these things with our own eyes are yet so amazed as to be unable to comprehend their reality." He goes on to describe the city as being as large as Seville or Cordova. He describes the technicals of the cities. He speaks of markets twice as large as Salamanca. On top of that, the Aztecs had a complex philosophy that's quite similar to the Hellenistic philosophies of Stoicism and Epicureanism. I won't, bore you with the details of that, but we can get into that if necessary, because it is pretty metaphysically and epistemologically similar to the Hellenistic philosophies. They had floating gardens, dams, sluice gates, effective control of the lake upon which they were situated. Those are some engineering feats. And lastly, I'll end with this for this point. As I say, of course, if you destroy an empire, it looks very unimpressive in a post-destruction analysis. This is quoting from Jill Lepore in These Truths. She said, in 1519, determined to ride to glory, Hernan Cortez, mayor of Santiago, Cuba, led 600 Spaniards and more than 1,000 native allies thundering across the land with 15 cannons. In Mexico, he captured Tenochtitlan, a city said to be grander than Paris or Rome, and destroyed it without pity or mercy. His men burned the Aztec libraries, their books of songs, their histories written down. In short, these empires and civilizations were formed over areas where modern countries stand that possess lower IQs were complex and advanced. Very clearly, then, intelligence as measured by IQ is not only not sufficient, but not necessary for being, quote, advanced. Finally, the statement that places with average IQs in the 60 to 80s will never have or have never produced advanced societies, in my view, has been falsified. So that's your first point. If you want to respond to all that, you can, because I know it's a lot.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Mesoamerican societies, so this is a little bit speculative from my angle here, but they're advanced to a certain degree, but compared to the advancements of European society, they're still quite a bit less advanced. There's aspects that we just don't know about the society. One thing we do know is that the population in the Americas was enormous prior to the diseases and everything that were brought over, wiping a lot of them out. Now, even in a lower IQ population, if you have a huge number of people to pull from, the elite of that society, maybe they, it was obviously a very structured society, and if you had some sort of system that really allowed the most intelligent from the society to collectively work together, you might see results that are much more impressive than most other societies with IQs in that range. But, it still is barely a candle held to the invention of almost all other initially we were talking about Africa, and you mentioned how not many inventions have come from Africa. I would challenge you to think of one, can you think of a single significant invention?
Well, you just snuck in the word significant. That changes everything. I mean, it depends on what you consider to be significant, but also this is the same thing Nick did. you're referring to sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, many inventions came out of Africa if you're counting, but we're going to get into that because you think that Egypt is white. I'll respond to that later on in this. I don't think they're white, right? I think that actually they were a multiracial society, even with black people. And so I don't actually believe the presupposition that you have, which says that anything that comes out of Egypt can't be attributed to African peoples. I think it definitionally can, and I think that it also ties into the obviously racially black people who lived there as well. But if I can say one thing about what you had said before, I would be interested to hear sort of what advancements you think place them so far above the rest. Because, I mean, we look at Rome, for example, and we say they were really advanced. And we don't say they were really advanced relative to some time period. We say that they were advanced. Why? Because they had plumbing and all this stuff. I mean, the Aztecs had plumbing too. Not only that, but as I mentioned, they were isolated. When you say, well, hey, if we instantiate this system that selects for people of various IQs, then we can get better results in a population with lower IQs. But that system has to be instantiated. And so if IQ is so determinative, why do some, according to this theory, why do some low IQ societies instantiate the system that maximizes their potential and some of them don't? Clearly, there are other factors at play, which is my entire point, that IQ is not as determinative as we want to make it seem. And the reason I jumped, by the way, to Guatemala is just because, as I said, it gets very complicated when you talk about any society in Egypt because they did interact with the other cultures at the time. You know, any empire that you choose, they interacted with Northern Africans, they interacted with Europeans, they interacted with Asians. And so I agree that it's hard to separate where exactly did these inventions come from. For example, a lot of people talk about the wheel. They say these people didn't even have the wheel. The wheel has only been invented a few times throughout history, and it's spread. It's not like each place independently invented the wheel. And so that's why I chose Mesoamericans, because they are so isolated. It's an interesting case study of IQ in isolation.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And, you know, I don't think that if their society truly rivaled its contemporaries in Europe.
Only in terms of mathematics and astronomy. But if you say, you know, guns, I mean, guns would not have been able to be built without the gunpowder from Asia. So this is what I mean by cross-cultural exchange is very important. They didn't have access to that. Not only that, but as the Joe Lepore quote points out, more natives fought against the Aztecs than Spaniards did.
What do you mean?
The army that conquered Tenochtitlan was 500 Spaniards and thousands of natives.
Right. Yeah, no, it's, I mean, I don't know that conquest can be strictly attributed to the superiority of whites. In that instance, you know, obviously there was the cultural miscommunications or however
and disease it was pretty bad. It wiped out a lot.
Yeah.
But you know, they obviously were technologically superior. I just would say that the distance is not as much as we want to make it seem. Really, it's kind of like Kennedy points out in The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, the upward technological spiral, it really happened in the age of modernity. If you go back to 1500s, the distance between Europe and other places was either non-existent or not that large. We made a lot of progress after like the printing press and these very important inventions came about. And we begin to explore and obviously explore slave labor and stuff like that to boost the economies. But prior to that, this gap just didn't really exist, especially if you're talking about between the power centers in the old world. So China, Europe, the Ottoman Empire.
But you do see, so as this explosion, you know, it makes sense to say, all right, there's certain circumstances that created momentum in certain areas. But then as other areas were exposed to that technological progress, other areas of Europe, they jumped on that train and were able to improvise new adaptations and new methods and improve on the technology in a variety of ways. That technology was brought into, say, Africa, and a lot of places, they, to this day, like if you dig a well in a lot of places in sub-Saharan Africa for them to have drinking water, if an animal dies in the well, they'll just stop using it. They don't, you know, there isn't any sort of cultural propensity to maintain infrastructure or an understanding of how to utilize it and improve upon it. And I think, there's aspects other than strictly IQ. I think that, as we talked about, Asians have the highest IQ, yet Europeans do seem to tend to innovate more. Specifically, why that is up for debate. I don't know if there's anyone claims to know exactly why that is, but there does seem to be something related to IQ and related to an inherent creativity that certain racial groups have in greater abundance than other racial groups, and it, even post the invention of many of these things, you see the way they interact with it. Asians, as they were exposed to a lot of the inventions from North America, that's where they build all the computers, and they're obviously very capable of integrating and working with these concepts. Africa, not so much. I don't think, do you think it's realistic to believe that a chip manufacturer is going to pop up in Africa?
Certainly. But I'll say this real quick, responding to those 2 points. There's 2 things I would say. On the point that, Europeans seem to be more innovative and Asians seem to be more technically smart, I would say that that's a conflation between, I'm not saying that it might not be true, by the way. On most of these claims, race realism, stuff like that, I'm agnostic. I'm actually not taking the negative position. I'm taking a position of agnosticism. We can't know. Because I think you're in danger of conflating the way that things have been with the way that things must be. I agree that Europeans have been more innovative, but there are other explanations as to why they could have been more innovative, like Paul Kennedy's desperation theory. But and then the prior point, which is that certain people seem to adopt the technologies better than others, I think that is, again, maybe descriptively true, but it's an exaggeration because other people have adopted it. For example, this is a pretty interesting thing. When the Europeans first initially colonized the New World, one of the justifications for colonizing, whether you're the Spaniards or the British, is that they said these people don't have government. And because they don't have government, they don't have sovereignty, and they can't claim dominion to the land, so it's ours. They exist in the state of nature, which is what a lot of the philosophers of the time were talking about. But once the northern natives came into contact with constitutionalism, written language, the printing press, a lot of them actually adopted it. They adopted their own written constitutions. They made their own written languages using the script of the Europeans. They adopted the printing press, and they made their own arguments in the courts of the Americans, begging for basically sovereignty, allowing them to be left alone, saying that we have civilized, and so that argument doesn't work. And then Europeans changed the argument. It was no longer about sovereignty. It was no longer about claiming dominion. It was about technological progress and manifest destiny. You're standing in the way of the railroad and, Samuel Morse's invention of the telegraph. And so it really seems ad hoc, that's one. But also, it's wrong to say that these people didn't adapt. A lot of them actually did. Now, when you say Africa, it's a little bit different again because there were less long-term settlements that existed in the continent of Africa. And so those tribes largely remained isolated. I mean, actually, Nick makes this point when he talks about how it wasn't really until the 19th century when we finally penetrated the interior of Africa. And so these people actually never really ran into technology in the same manner that, say, the natives did. And you could also argue that by the time they did run into the technology, the gap was too large to adapt. Maybe if you're a native person and the only thing that they have over you is written language or the printing press or constitutionalism, you might be able to adapt. But if, they have we already had or cross ocean wires that were connecting people via the telegraph. Flying was invented a few decades after. The technological gap was extremely large. And so to expect them to just instantly adapt or maybe even to ever adapt, I think that that's asking too much.
No, I mean, I don't disagree that Native Americans adapted. I live in Canada, so they have checkmated the legal system here, and are the beneficiaries of enormous amounts of tax revenue because they have done a good job of working the legal system. But when they were also integrated into society. If you look at their contributions to, you know, the STEM field, different any kind of technological innovation, things like that, there is very little representation there.
I'm not
And
sure that I
it's
would
not
agree they're integrated into society. Natives? I don't know about that. Oh, Canada, maybe. Sorry, you're speaking about Canada. I don't know about
I'm in
Canada.
Canada.
Yeah,
If you're a native, you're entitled to free education for your whole life, like
sure.
postgraduate. And so
I spoke to a
throughout my
native from Canada,
lifetime,
and they said a lot of them still live on reservations. I don't know if that's true. Uh,
they are given free housing on reservations, but they're under no obligation, and they have subsidized housing if they leave the reservation. So in terms of there's certainly been no lack of opportunities. Um,
I would say
but
Canadians overall, though, are going to not be super represented in terms of, uh, STEM.
oh, that's not true. That no, Canadians have had an enormous impact. You know, we aerospace. Yeah, we've the medical field. I don't know if you ever heard the Canada arm on the spaceship, or we over for the size of our population historically, we've contributed a ton, and I've been to places like Iceland, and it's 300,000 people is the population. And I would encourage you to look up a list of the inventions. I was just in the hot tub, and I was just talking to some guy who was maybe 5 years older than me, maybe in his late 40s, and he was a professional swimmer who had invented the method for distinguishing between two different people's DNA in a fluid sample, which allowed rape victims to identify the DNA of the rapist.
Sure.
And so like, if you're in a white country like that, like Iceland is one of the most ethnically monogamous countries there is, of just white people, and you are encountering people left and right who are contributing to the sciences and math. If you were to go to an African country, even one that has, been in contact with civilization for millennia, like Ethiopia, you're not going to run into, you're not going to have situations like that.
Sure. So
It's
on this, I would say a few things. I would say, one, I'm somewhat skeptical that there are going to be major areas in which Canada is overrepresented in terms of contributions. I'm not, you might not have anything on hand to give statistics wise, but if you ever find so, I would be interested to have that sent my way. Because, I mean, when you talk about STEM, the best STEM universities are going to be, in America, MIT, Caltech. And most of the important medical research, again, is going to come out of America. I mean, we spearheaded the vaccine development. And so I wouldn't agree with that. I would also say that a lot of the STEM developments, now you're going to point out a selection bias, which is fair, but most of the STEM developments are actually beginning to come from non-white populations, the people like Indian immigrants who come to America, and so on. And so when we're talking about like white versus non-white, the most STEM productive country it's going to be America. And America, in terms of its production, I can actually pull up a lot of stats on this. We're basically being led, by and large, in terms of representation by immigrants. In terms of the STEM development, the proportion of immigrants and foreign students at universities correlates to patents. It correlates to innovation overall. The immigrants founded about half of Fortune 500 companies. They're overrepresented in terms of patents themselves. And so not only the schools, but the immigrants themselves. And so when you look at the most productive countries for STEM, it's America, and America is largely a diverse society.
I have doubts because it's easy to put out numbers on patents and Fortune 500 companies, but the actual contributions of those patents and companies might shake out a little bit differently.
But that's just prognostication. We can't verify that. As far as the numbers project, immigrants are more productive.
When
And they're
I see
overrepresented in
something,
STEM and graduate degrees too.
when I see something actually useful and innovative invented, though, I don't. I shouldn't say never, but I almost never see an Indian person or anything else. Sometimes a Chinese person for sure, or Japanese, but I don't see African people. You know,
That's just not really the way
at the
innovation works in STEM anymore, though. It's not like, hey, I invented the light bulb. It's like, hey, we refined the algorithm such that, I mean, for example, I know you gave way to Chinese people, but TikTok is a white invention that has been remarkable in terms of its ability to capture the attention of
That's
people.
true. I don't know if I can consider TikTok as much of an invention though. Like there was Vine. It's basically
It's way
a
better than
carbon
Vine.
copy of Vine. It is an improvement.
Also, it's
But it's
completely
not.
different in terms of the way that it feeds you things. It doesn't feed you based on following. It feeds you based on your activity. It runs off of
Yeah.
large language or not large language models, deep learning algorithms.
Yeah, no, I mean I won't take that away. That is impressive. Okay, I did just look up a list of some Canadian inventions, historical. Insulin, polio vaccines, the pacemaker, green ink, canola oil, the telephone, the snowmobile, the electric wheelchair, IMAX movies, the pager, standard time, quartz clock. There's a lot more.
So to
Peanut
be clear,
butter.
though, listing inventions doesn't actually tell us the proportional representation of inventions, right? That's one. And then
But
two, I would
well,
also say
so
that those are so temporally disjunctive, it almost makes it seem like they don't produce a lot. Because, when you're like, well, hey, we invented, paper and then we invented TikTok, it's like, what happened in between the invention of paper and TikTok? Tons of other things. And you're
yeah, no,
basically implicitly admitting that those weren't yours.
I'm not going to be exhaustive with the list, but Canada, for its, you know, population density, we are at 39 million people now. But most of these inventions are all going through the 90s.
I would also be curious just to see if immigrants are also overrepresented in STEM there. Because I know there are a lot of Indians in Canada. And if they're performing
Yeah,
like they are in America, well, then you may be claiming some Indian inventions. But if you want, though,
no,
we can go on to point two, because I don't think we're going to... It'll all coalesce. And point two, you bring up Jewish IQ. You say that they have